Well, I am Bob Stewart, and this is 21st Century Myths about God and Science. And what I find when I speak on this subject is that this subject is one that can provoke strong emotions. And I find that curious because when I was in high school and college, I didn't get all that emotional about science. My first degree was in music, but I've gotten over it. It didn't warp me forever, but it was, yeah. And so then I moved on to philosophy, which is probably even more useless. And certainly you can't, at least when I was in music, I could get someone to pay me $30 for a half-hour piano lesson, and nobody's ever paid me $30 to talk to me for 30 minutes about philosophy. But I'm not going to be able to cover nearly as much as I would like to cover on this subject. We have a class at the seminary, both at the graduate master's level and at the PhD level, where I teach on Christianity and the sciences. In fact, Tawa Anderson, who's also speaking here, will be team teaching the PhD seminar with me this spring on Christianity and the sciences. But if you want to see more, I've written a little book, Honest Answers to Hard Questions When Christian Faith is Challenged. And the fourth article, Can I Believe in Both Science and the Bible, has a lot of what I'm going to say today, and a lot more than I'm going to be able to say today about some of these questions. Then I also do want to say we do have an apologetics conference in January, and it's 4 days long, and I do hope that some of you will come to it. We have great group rates, and I'm hoping that some of your staff will want to be group leaders. Let's pray, and then we'll get started with talking about this subject. Father, I do thank you for giving me the opportunity to teach here, and for Wade and Bo being so open to having apologetics as part of their ministry here. And Lord, I just pray that you will help all of us to live to the glory of God. In Jesus' name, amen. So, myth number one is that prior to Columbus, Christians thought that the world was flat. In fact, that's what I grew up thinking. I think I was in fourth grade when my elementary school teacher authoritatively said that prior to the Columbus, people, primarily under the influence of the Christian worldview, although she did not say that, she didn't use the word worldview in fourth grade history, thought that the world was flat. Well, I can safely say that no educated medieval Christian believed in a flat earth. In fact, very few ancient or medieval non-Christians believed in a flat earth. Now, the one exception that I know of were ancient Egyptians, but ancient Egyptians were not Christians. Virtually no Greek or Roman believed in a flat earth. Come on in. I think we've got one chair over there. And among those who knew, that we knew that the earth was not flat, was this guy named Pythagoras. Maybe you heard about him in high school mathematics. Or Aristotle. Or Ptolemy. Between the year AD 200 and the year AD 1400, more than 100 Christian writers discussed the shape of the world, and only 2 of them maintained that the earth was flat. Think about Dante and his Divine Comedy. Well, the Divine Comedy is based upon a spherical view of the earth and the world. Here's a medieval picture, a painting of Christ. And notice what Christ is holding in his hand. It's what we call a globus cruciger. It's a globe. It's the world and a cross on top of it. And that is intended to show that Christ has the whole world in his hand. Or this picture. This is a coronation picture of Richard II. And Richard II died in 1400. And yet he again is holding a globus cruciger in his hand. Or this is even more telling. This is the Erdapfel. Anybody speak German? We do have a German speaker in the room. Haben wir hier jemanden, der Deutsch spricht? Well, Earth apple. Apfel is German for apple. Erd is the earth. It's a globe. And it dates to the year 1491. Now, what's that little rhyme that you learned in elementary school that you're going to have to remember now? If in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, how is it if people thought that the world was flat, that we've got all these globus crucigers predating Columbus? This is a globe of the world. So Columbus's detractors did not think that the earth was flat, or that ships would fall off the edge of the earth if they sailed too far. They rightly thought that the earth was much larger than Columbus claimed. And they were correct, and Columbus was wrong, and that he could not reach the East Indies by sailing west. But Columbus got lucky, and the Americas, which Europeans did not know about, got in his way. So, how did the idea that people in Columbus's time thought that the earth was flat become so widespread if we have so much evidence that people thought anything but that the earth was flat? They came to think that because a famous fiction writer named Washington Irving, remember the legend of Sleepy Hollow, wrote a largely false biography of Christopher Columbus. And here's a cover of a reprint of it. The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus by Washington Irving. And the logic's simple, and the logic is absurd. Medieval Christians believed that the world was flat because they were ignorant. How do we know that they were ignorant? Because they thought the world was flat. That is just viciously circular. So let's get over this idea that medieval Christians thought that the world was flat. Myth number 2 is that science and Christianity have always been in conflict with each other. Here's a popular depiction of it from Science Action Stories. Meanwhile, Jesus and Darwin were fighting again. Well, you don't get the impression that Christianity and science are fighting one another from reading the Bible. Let's look at Psalm 111, verse 2. Great are the works of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them. Or Psalm 19, verses 1 through 3. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Or in the New Testament, Romans chapter 1, verse 20 says this, "Since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Or this prayer, this is not in the Bible, but this is a famous prayer. "If I have been enticed into brashness by the wonderful beauty of your works, or if I have loved my own glory among men, while advancing in work destined for your glory, gently and mercifully pardon me, and finally, deign graciously to cause that these demonstrations may lead to your glory and to the salvation of souls, and nowhere be an obstacle to that. Amen." Do you know who prayed that prayer?
Puritans?
Pardon me?
The Puritans?
Not the Puritans, although it sounds like something they would pray. Johannes Kepler, 1619, and that's the ending of this book, Harmonies of the World. Or Isaac Newton, who said this, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. When I look at the solar system, I see the earth at the right distance from the sun to receive the proper amounts of heat and light. This did not happen by chance." Or Nicholas Copernicus, "To know the mighty works of God, to comprehend His wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful workings of His laws, surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more grateful than knowledge." But so frequently we hear that scientists don't believe in God. But the evidence is quite the opposite. Here's just the tiniest list of scientists who have been committed Christians. Nicholas Copernicus, who was the first to conceive of a heliocentric, a sun-centered solar system. Galileo, he wasn't the first person to think that the sun was at the center of the solar system, but Galileo introduces observational astronomy. Kepler, laws of planetary motion. Isaac Newton, probably the greatest scientist who ever lived, who refined the scientific method and stated the laws of motions. But Newton's greatest accomplishment was to understand that gravity was the key for understanding our universe. Or Joseph Lister, antiseptic surgery, or Pasteur, bacteriology, or Robert Boyle, chemistry and gas dynamics, George Cuvier, comparative anatomy, Charles Babbage, computer science, Lord Rayleigh, dimensional analysis, Fleming, electronics, Maxwell, electrodynamics, Faraday, electrodynamics and field theory, Kelvin, energetics, Fabre, entomology, the study of insects, Stokes, fluid mechanics, Mendel, Hershey, galactic astronomy, and Gregor Mendel, genetics. And so much great work is being done in the field of genetics. But someone might say, these guys are old. Now, not all these guys are old. But a frequent line that I hear from atheists is that 400 or 500 years ago, it would have made sense to be a Christian. It would have made sense to believe in God, but now we know better. Surely no modern scientist could believe in God. Now, I don't know. Oh, there it is. For some reason on the tablet, all I've got is a blue and white bar where Francis Collins should be. This is Francis Collins. Who is Francis Collins? Does anyone know? He's, by anybody's account, one of the top 5 living scientists today. He was the director of the Human Genome Project. He's the man whose work led to isolating the gene that causes cystic fibrosis and about 10 or 11, 12 other genetic diseases. He's the recently retired director of the National Institutes of Health. And at one point in his life, he was an atheist. He writes this, "For quite a while in my 20s, I was a pretty obnoxious atheist. At the age of 27, after a good deal of intellectual debating with myself about the plausibility of faith, and particularly with strong influence from C.S. Lewis," commercial note, my wife and I over the summer wrote a book on C.S. Lewis, and it's at our book table. Drop by and buy it. We're selling it cheaper than Amazon. And if you buy, they're $8 a piece, and on Amazon they're $9.99. And if you buy 3, we'll give you all that for $20. But anyway, particularly with C.S. Lewis, I became convinced that this was a decision I wanted to make. And I became by choice a Christian, a serious Christian, who believes that faith is not something that you just do on Sunday, but if it makes any sense at all, it is a part of your whole life. It's the most important organizing principle in my life. Or this book, 100 Years of Nobel Prizes and More. You know, the Nobel Prize began in 1900. They've only been around for 123 years. It's relatively recent history. And this man, Baruch Shalev, who wrote this book, is the preeminent historian of the Nobel Prizes. And Shalev estimates, and to my knowledge, I think he's a Jewish man, not a Christian, but he estimates that roughly 65% of Nobel Prize winners in physics and over 70% of Nobel Prize winners in chemistry were Christians or had Christian backgrounds. So it kind of puts the lie to this trope that we hear, this meme that we see so often, that intelligent people can't possibly believe in God. Well, then where does this myth that Christianity and science are at war comes from? I'm glad you asked. Well, it comes to us primarily from 2 men who wrote at the end of the 19th century. One was Andrew Dixon White. Andrew Dixon White was the first president of Cornell University. Now, Cornell University was the first university in America that was not started as a Christian university, that was started as a secular university. It's a very fine university. It's an Ivy League school. My son was a PhD student in philosophy at Cornell. And then John William Draper, a professor of chemistry and photography at NYU, New York University. So Draper wrote a book called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science in 1874. And Andrew Dickson wrote a book entitled History of the Warfare of Science and Theology. Andrew Dixon White wrote a book, History of Warfare Between Science and Theology. And so here's a quotation from Draper. He says this, and he writes this in the book, the antagonism we thus witness between religion and science is the continuation of a struggle that commenced when Christianity began to attain political power. A divine revelation must necessarily be intolerant of contradiction. It must repudiate all improvement in itself and view with disdain that arising from the progressive intellectual development of man. But our opinions on every subject are continually liable to modification from the irresistible advance of human knowledge. The history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. It is a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side, and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interest on the other. And that's on page 6, Roman numeral 6, of his book. Now notice how science expands knowledge and faith restricts or compresses it. But this view, which has been revived by some of the new atheists like Richard Dawkins or like Daniel Dennett, has been widely rejected for some time now by serious historians of science. In fact, here's what an agnostic historian of science, Ronald Numbers, has to say about this warfare thesis. And it actually, that's a linguistic term that has some currency in the history of science, the warfare thesis. Ronald Numbers says, there's a powerful mythology today suggesting that science and religion are enemies. And it is fueled by some of the most public and popular of scientists, such as Carl Sagan in the United States or Richard Dawkins in Great Britain, who have gone out of their way on occasions to present that view. Or here's what Lawrence Principi of Johns Hopkins University, perhaps Johns Hopkins. I always have a hard time saying Johns with an S on it. Johns Hopkins University. And he is perhaps the world's foremost historian of science, said concerning the warfare thesis, and this is a picture of Principi. He says, no serious historians of science or of the science-religion issue today maintain the warfare thesis. The origins of the warfare thesis lie in the late 19th century, specifically in the work of two men, John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White. These men had specific political purposes in mind when arguing their case, and the historical foundations of their work are unreliable. He goes on to say this, how does Draper support his contention of conflict? Well, unfortunately, with some of the worst historical writing you are ever likely to come across. Historical facts are confected, causes and chronologies twisted to the author's purpose. We find interpretations made merely by declaration. We find quotations violently taken out of context, and instances, quite a few of them, where Draper claims a historical writer said something, in fact, 180 degrees away from what he actually claimed. Much of Draper's book is so ridiculous, so melodramatic, so rabid, it's hard for a knowledgeable person actually to read it without a wry smirk. He goes on to say this: while we can look today with astonishment upon the shoddy character of Draper and White's writings, their books have had enormous impact, and we can't deny that. Much of this is due to their great success in their creating a myth for science as a religion. And as we know, or should know, myths are often much more powerful than historical realities. And so you can just go on Google and find PDFs of both of these books. Now, to my mind, White's book is less virulently opposed to Christianity than Draper's book. In fact, he dedicates the book to a Christian minister. I have more about that in the little book that I'm selling at this conference. So the Christian worldview is not only consistent with science, it enables and empowers science by assuming that God is other than the universe, and that the universe is orderly, and that the universe is intelligible. Here's what the Catholic Bishop Robert Barron has to say. He says, "It is no accident that modern science first appeared precisely in Christian Europe, where a doctrine of creation held sway. To hold that the world is created is to accept simultaneously the two assumptions required for science, namely that the universe is not divine and that it is marked through and through by intelligibility." And intelligibility is simply a 50-cent word for understandability. Okay? The universe can be understood. If the world or nature is considered divine, as it is in many philosophies and mysticisms, then one would never allow oneself to analyze it, dissect it, or perform experiments upon it. But a created world, by definition, is not divine. It is other than God. And in that very otherness, scientists find their freedom to act. At the same time, if the world is unintelligible, no science would get off the ground, since all science is based upon the presumption that nature can be known, that it has a form. But the world, precisely as created by a divine intelligence, is thoroughly intelligible or understandable, and hence scientists have the confidence to seek, explore, and experiment. So actually the Christian worldview paved the way for the development of modern science, and it's not an accident that modern science develops in the Christian West. Myth number 3. What can't be proven by science should not be believed. What can't be proven by science should not be believed. So I'm going to quote to you from Stephen Hawking, one of his last books before he passed away. And Hawking, along with his co-writer Leonard Mlodinow, I know that doesn't look like Mlodinow, but it is, believe me, say this: traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Now, I have to say, as a philosopher, when I read that, it hurt my feelings. But philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. And that's on page 5 of the Grand Design. Well, let me say this as charitably as possible. That's just ridiculous. This myth that you can't believe anything that science can't prove is demonstrably false, and I intend to demonstrate that it's false. Consider this: science cannot account for some of the things that we are most certain of and that we value most highly. For instance, science, these are just a few of the things, this is not an all-inclusive list, that science can't account for. Science can't account for logical and mathematical truths. Science presupposes that math works. Science presupposes logic. It doesn't explain them, nor does it discover them. Science can't account for ethical beliefs. Science can't show us that acts like the Nazis experimenting on the Jews or human trafficking were and are evil. Science can't account for aesthetic judgments, for beauty, for artistic beauty. The beautiful, like the good, is beyond scientific proof. Now, we can take a great painting and we can scientifically analyze it. And science can tell us the age of the canvas. They can tell us what kind of chemicals were used in the paints. They can tell us what kinds of brushes were used and how they were used. But they can't identify the beauty, because the beauty's not in the materials that the beauty uses to express itself, and that sort of thing. Science can't tell us why Beethoven is great music and Boxcar Willie isn't. That's just the way it is. In fact, science can't justify the scientific method itself. Okay? So here's what an atheist scientist has to say. He says this: science cannot answer the questions that philosophers or children ask. I don't know how I feel as a philosopher being grouped with children, but intuition's a big thing for us. Why are we here? What is the point of being alive? How ought we to behave? These questions may be interesting, but scientists are no more qualified to comment on them than is anyone else. Another thing that science can't account for is consciousness. This question, you didn't say consciousness this morning in a question to me, but it was about consciousness, our very awareness that we are individuals having individual experiences. That I'm thinking my thoughts and I'm having my feelings and my anxieties and insecurities. I have my beliefs. I have my choices, preferences. This sense that I am me and you are you, and the same sense that you have. And we experience this over and over and over and over every day of our life. So now what I want to do is show you one of the world's most significant philosophers of mind. And he's also an atheist. And his name is Thomas Nagel. And so this is from a recent book by Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel teaches at NYU, New York University, which is one of our finest schools for philosophy. Nagel says this: the existence of consciousness is both one of the most familiar, I said over and over, we experience it every day, and one of the most astounding things about the world. No conception of the natural order that does not reveal it as something to be expected can aspire even to the outline of completeness. And if physical science, whatever it may have to say about the origin of life, leaves us necessarily in the dark about consciousness, that shows that it cannot provide the basic form of intelligibility for this world. There must be a very different way in which things as they are make sense. And that includes the way the physical world is, since the problem cannot be quarantined in the mind. Now, that sounds like something I've said and something I've written, and he may say it better than I would say it, but he's an atheist, not a Christian, not even a theist. So why would Thomas Nagel believe this? Well, he tells us in a different book, an earlier book, Thomas Nagel on his unbelief. He says, I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. Now let me give you a caution here. Do your own thinking. Don't follow someone else's thinking just because they're smarter than you are. If you think very long and very hard, invariably you will encounter someone who is smarter than you who believes something ridiculous. Okay? So don't give your mind over to anybody else simply on the basis of authority. Okay? But he's bothered by this fact. He wants atheism to be true. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. He doubles down. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. My guess is that this cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition, and that it is responsible for much of the scientism and reductionism of our time. One of the tendencies it supports is the ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about human life, including everything about the human mind. This is a somewhat ridiculous situation. It is just as irrational to be influenced in one's beliefs by the hope that God does not exist as by the hope that God does exist. So he's basically criticizing his own basis for atheism. So let me ask you some simple questions. Will it be okay if I quiz you? It's not a hard quiz, okay? It's not a hard quiz. Here we go. Question number 1. Was Hitler a good man? Prove it scientifically. Was Mother Teresa a good woman? Prove it scientifically. Is Phoebe a great composer? If you've ever seen the television show Friends, you know that maybe we've exposed a generational divide in this classroom. Ask a millennial if Phoebe's a great composer. She's not. Was Beethoven a great composer? Yeah. Is the Mona Lisa a great work of art? Yes, it is. Now, I have a hard time at the seminary convincing some of my male students that the Mona Lisa is a great work of art, because the Mona Lisa does not look like a swimsuit model. But the question is not, is the Mona Lisa an extremely attractive woman? Would she make the People magazine's 100 most beautiful people list? Is it great art? And it certainly is. So I hope I've put at least 3 myths to bed. Here's another myth. You have to choose between science and Christianity. You can't be both a man of faith or a woman of faith and a scientist. Now, most of the time this myth is not stated exactly this way. It's stated something like, science deals with facts, religion deals with faith. And then faith is defined in a way that no Christian theologian ever has. But it doesn't come right out and say that religion is false, but they'll say religion's not objective. But neither is science, for that matter. Now, that's not my point, and I don't want to take you into philosophy land, a place where I go and I tell people what they already know in language they can't understand. But this idea, this myth, says scientific investigation or the scientific search for knowledge is better and more legitimate than the religious search for knowledge. And so, by implication, religious knowledge is either wrong, false, or substandard. But this myth is simply a way of saying that science is either the best way of knowing or the only way of knowing. But if it is true that science is the best way of knowing, where does that leave us? So is it true? Is it true that science is the best way of knowing? It's not true. I'll cut to the chase. But when scientists say this sort of thing, they've stopped doing science and started doing a particular type of philosophy. And we philosophers call this type of philosophy bad philosophy. So this is not science, but rather scientism. And scientism is an ideology, not a discipline, that says that the scientific method applies to all disciplines, or that one can only know what the scientific method proves. So let me give you a tip about what to say if you run into this myth. Say something like, well, if it is true that you have to choose between science or Christianity, or if they have a weaker kind of scientism that says science is a better way of knowing than other somewhat legitimate ways of knowing, or if it's true that science is the best type of knowledge, certainly if it's the only type of knowledge, then we would want to know that that was true scientifically, right? So show me scientifically that it's science or faith. Show me scientifically that science is the best way of knowing. Do you see how that works? Now, unfortunately, sometimes Christians say the same sort of thing about science and Christianity. They just come at it from the other angle, from the opposite perspective. They say, we don't need science. I've had students in my classes say things like, science is always proven to be wrong, and with a straight face. Now, that does show an awareness that science over time has improved. I mean, Friday night, I talked to a group of students about C.S. Lewis. Lewis's mother was operated on in the 1900s at home in her bedroom for cancer. Now, which one of you wants to be operated at home in your bedroom if you get cancer? So modern science is better than older science was, but modern science, we know, doesn't have everything figured out. Okay? But that doesn't mean that science has always been wrong. It just means that science has a habit of improving itself. So, what we ought to say to the Christian who says this is, show me in the Bible that it's science or faith. Show me in the Bible that the Bible is the best source of information on nature. Tell me the passage in the Bible that you go to find out if you've got COVID. You know, that's just not reasonable. And I've already covered that you don't get the idea that science and Christianity are at war from reading the Bible. So no matter who says it, this is a false dilemma anytime you're told that you have to choose between science and faith. Here's what Augustine said in the 5th and early 6th. Augustine lived in the 5th and early 6th centuries. He said, "One does not read in the gospel that the Lord said, 'I will send you the Paraclete,' the Holy Spirit, who will teach you about the course of the sun and the moon. For he willed to make them Christians, not mathematicians." So here's what a great mathematician has to say about this. Now, how many of you know who John Lennox is? Have any of you ever heard this name? You've heard the name. You should check John Lennox out. Go to YouTube, go to Amazon.com, JohnLennox. Now, John is a good friend of mine, and we met roughly 20 years ago. And he has 3 doctorates, one from Oxford, one from Cambridge, and one, I believe, from Sheffield or Manchester. He can speak fluently about 8 languages. And he is a professor of pure mathematics. I remember the first time I met him, I was in Oxford, England, at Oxford University, and he was going to be speaking that night, and someone came to me and said, would you be willing to take our speaker out to dinner before the lecture this evening? We were glad to do that. So it was my wife and I and our son, our eldest child. I've taken all my children to Oxford. I've taken all my children to Scotland in particular because I'm a sturt. And I make them eat the haggis. I tell them, you eat the haggis or you change your name. And anyway, my son at this point was trying to decide whether he would major in philosophy or mathematics. And so Lennox has a PhD in philosophy and he has a PhD in mathematics. And he was very excited about this, and he's Irish. And so he began to quiz my son, and he said, so, which is better, algebra or geometry? And immediately Ray said, algebra. Good boy. And why is algebra better than geometry? And Ray said, because you can figure it out. That's right. That's why I don't teach those lower maths like calculus. I'm into figuring out the fabric of the universe. So this is the guy that we're going to be hearing from here. And he's a committed biblical Christian. John says this. Pray for John. He recently had a stroke. He's on the mend, but nevertheless, when it comes to thinking about God, why do some otherwise rational, intelligent people seem unaware that they become irrational? They insist on offering the public a choice between God and science, when elementary logic should tell them that theology and science are not alternatives but complementary. God is an explanation in terms of agency, and science in terms of mechanism and law. I find it easy to explain this distinction to most teenagers. And so when it comes to understanding the nature of the universe, science does a great job of backwards engineering. Backwards engineering is taking something and examining it to see how it was put together. So for instance, if a computer company makes an advance, all of its competitors will buy a number of its computers and put their technicians to work on examining what they've done, so that is so cool, and that what their competitors would like to do, but their competitors also have to find a different way to do it because of patent law, right? And so that's backwards engineering. And science can do a really good job of that sort of thing. But it would be silly for me to say that Henry Ford never existed just because we can understand how a Model T works, because we can backwards engineer a Model T. Henry Ford is a person, and that gives us an explanation of an automobile in terms of agency and purpose. His thinking about designing it and his purpose for designing it. While backwards engineering, understanding the physical process of something coming to be, gives us an explanation in terms of mechanism and law. But if you think that the physical sciences tell us everything that we need to know about creation and human life, then you will be committed to this silly idea. Now, this doesn't make science a failure as a way of knowing. I love science. I'm a philosopher of science. That's not my primary field. Philosophy of religion is my primary field, but it's an area of competence for me. But it does limit science to being a way of knowing certain things in a certain manner. It doesn't make science a failure. It does make scientism, which is an ideology, not a discipline, a failure. And a worldview that can't answer those questions, like why is the beautiful beautiful? Why is the good good? Why does the scientific method work? What is consciousness, is woefully deficient. So science cannot and does not say anything about God or the soul, because science deals with matter and energy, and God and the soul are not material, and they're not subject to mechanism or law. So to think that we could prove that God doesn't exist through science is simply a category mistake. It's also a category mistake to think that we can prove God exists through science. But hold that thought. It's a category mistake. So what's a category mistake? A category mistake is when you say something like a sunset isn't beautiful because you can't hear it on your cell phone. You're using the wrong means of examination to get at it. So both science and theology are good gifts from God. And we need to celebrate both of them and use both of them to learn the truth about life, not just the universe, in ways that each is intended to be used. Okay, so we need more Christians to go into the sciences and to take their faith with them. And I've written pretty extensively on this and in other places. But together, science and faith give us the best explanation of life. And a worldview that is lacking in either respect is hopelessly incomplete. Now, the article in the book that I mentioned earlier goes much deeper into detail. It talks about causation. It talks about the multiverse. Another myth that I would love to have time to cover, but I'd have to teach a whole section on it, is that an atheist love to say this: the multiverse explains everything. No, it doesn't. But I have a good bit in that article and written in as non-technical a way as I could about that. So let me just say one more thing before I open it up for Q&A. There is a difference between saying science can't prove that God exists and taking facts that are scientific facts and philosophically reasoning from these facts to God's existence. One of my favorite ways to argue, and I particularly use this when I talk to atheists, I will ask them, how old is the universe? Now, I tell Christians, don't argue the age of the earth. It's older than you are. Okay? I tell Christians, when you talk to atheists, don't argue evolution. If we could disprove evolution, it wouldn't prove Christianity. And if evolution were proved, it wouldn't disprove Christianity. And it's a totally complicated conversation. I mean, it's so complicated that most biologists, physicists, chemists can't even understand the subject matter. And they're professionals. It's a trip that we don't need to take. It's like trying to get from New Orleans to Baton Rouge by going through Sydney, Australia. We just don't need to do it. But then you might say, well, then why do you ask the atheist how old the earth is? I do it because I'm sneaky. And about 2/3 of the time, they'll say, well, the universe is 13.8 billion years old, something like that. Now, you may or may not think that the universe is old. I'm not going to share my own views. We're not going to get into that. It's not about the age of the universe. But when they say that, I've got them. Because they've admitted that the universe has a birthday. And if you've got a birthday, you had a beginning. And so a very simple argument that you can then use is anything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And the best cosmology says that the universe had a beginning. And so, now that doesn't prove that God exists. It proves that the universe has a cause. But it tells us something about the cause. Because the universe is composed of matter and energy and space and time. So the cause of matter and energy, space, and time can't be matter or energy, space, or time. So the cause has to be immaterial. It's outside time. It has to be eternal. The Big Bang happened 13.8 billion years ago, and the universe has been expanding ever since. That's a pretty powerful explosion. It has to be very powerful. Our universe is so finely tuned at a subatomic level that means intelligence. And intelligence is not had by impersonal objects, so that makes the cause personal. Let me ask you, who does that sound like? Outside space, eternal, powerful, intelligent, and personal. Now that doesn't prove Christianity. Christianity is Jesus Christ, God coming to earth as a human being, living a perfect life, dying on the cross for our sins, rising from the dead, ascending to the Father, that sort of thing. But it goes a long way towards that. Do you see how this kind of stuff, but that's not a scientific argument, that's a philosophical argument that takes some scientific facts as a starting point. So, I'll take your Q&A if you have Q&A. And
I have a question about atheists. Do they believe in right, wrong, evil?
Yeah. So, atheists are not monolithic. Don't you hate it when someone says, every Christian believes this? Not all atheists are the same. My experience is that most atheists do believe in right and wrong. However, some atheists don't. And most of the new atheists, and I don't have time to go into what the new atheists are. This is not a constant commercial, but get my book. There's a chapter on what's wrong with the new atheism. Many of them actually do think, because they do what Nagel says, this ridiculous reductionism that attributes everything to evolutionary biology, that there's nothing right and nothing wrong. And that right and wrong, we just march to music of our genes, is what Richard Dawkins says. But in fact, it undermines truth for many of them. But others of them just take right and wrong as a brute fact. Just some things are right and some things are wrong. And that's a point at which then we can argue from our shared sense of morality. And this is what C.S. Lewis does in Mere Christianity. In Mere Christianity, he starts with something that has happened to every single one of us. Somebody cuts in line in front of us. And we say, that's wrong. But if it's really wrong, there has to be some standard of right and wrong. And so frequently when I make arguments from morality for God, atheists think that I'm saying atheists can't be moral. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that their worldview doesn't give them a good basis upon which to be moral. But most atheists know right from wrong and are very concerned. And for instance, I had an example happen with a friend of mine who's an atheist philosopher, teaches at Florida State University. He and I did a book about 14 years ago together named Michael Ruse. And we were searching for another philosophy professor at the seminary. And so my bosses said, email all your friends and see if they would like to come work here, or better yet, if any of their students who will work for chump change would like to come work here. So I send out an email to all my philosopher friends, whether they're Christians or not. And almost immediately, Michael responds. Now, Michael has written, and I can give you the source. I think it's actually in the book. I'm not really trying to sell the book. I don't make that much money on the book, but it's a useful source of information. Michael actually said that our genes fake us out into thinking that there's an objective right and wrong, that there's an objective morality binding upon all of us. So bear that in mind. That's Michael's view, that evolution just drives us. And then Michael, within an hour, emails me and says, I could never recommend any of my students to an institution that teaches that homosexuality is a sin. And I came this close to emailing them back and asking, what gene faked you out into thinking that would be wrong? But so that's, so there really is, atheism is just riddled with contradictions.
Did you say he was a scientist or a philosopher?
He's a philosopher of science and a historian of science. And he's a pretty fair-minded guy. He's written a number of books that I would recommend. And one that we worked on together, which is now out of print, which means you can buy it for chump change on the internet. You can buy it for way less than it sold for when it was being printed. So, all right. Well, thanks very much. And I think I'm preaching in the service tonight, and that's going to be on the resurrection. And the resurrection is a lot easier to understand for Christians than science is. But I've tried to be as plain as possible. Thanks for coming.